Good afternoon. My name is Peter Fahm, and I'm the director of the Michael S. Ansari Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council. On behalf of our chairman, Senator Chuck Hagel, and our president and CEO, Fred Kemp, it's a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to our discussion on ripples across the sands, the impact of the fall of Gaddafi on security in the Maghreb and the Sahel. The Michael S. Ansari Africa Center was established 2 years ago with the mission to help transform U.S. and European policy approaches to Africa by emphasizing the building of strong geopolitical partnerships with African states and strengthening economic growth and prosperity on the continent. The center seeks to engage and inform both policymakers and the general public of the strategic importance of Africa, both globally and for American and European interests in particular. Our programming this year focuses on the epochal changes the continent is experiencing in its geopolitical framework, with the Arab Spring in North Africa, the birth of a new state in South Sudan, as well as ongoing and continuing challenges with state collapse, conflict, piracy, and more recently famine in Somalia, and the growing nexus between extremism and criminality in West Africa. I invite you to visit our website and to sign up for updates for our future programs. And I'd also add a note that, especially for any members of the press here, that our panelists are speaking in their own names and as subject matter experts, and that their comments are not necessarily representative of the views of the organizations which they are affiliated. And although Ambassador Ed Gabriel represents Morocco, he's speaking here in his personal capacity. While NATO formally ended its military operations in Libya on October 31st, this important milestone was by no means the end of the security challenges which result directly or indirectly from the change of regime in Libya. Just a few data underscore the point. News reports indicate that U.S. officials believe as many as 20,000 portable heat-seeking missiles, manpads, have gone missing. Senior Gaddafi regime officials, including son Saif al-Islam, intelligence chief Abdullah al-Sanusi, have slipped out of the country and are still at large, the latter reportedly hiding in Niger. Just today, Niger's defense minister announced that his country's army had intercepted a heavily armed convoy that entered the country from southern Libya and was headed to Mali. In the convoy were both Libyan nationals and Tuareg tribesmen. Large flows of African refugees have left Libya, including 230,000 who have crossed over into Niger alone. Libyan arms are also flooding markets in neighboring countries, just at a moment when terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and Boko Haram are flexing their muscle. Yesterday here at the Atlantic Council, we had the privilege of hosting a luncheon discussion with the heads and members of 3 delegations, those of Mali, Mauritania, and Niger, which were in town for meetings with U.S. officials on these very issues. While I can't go into the specifics of our conversation, it suffices to say that there's deep concern and an urgent plea for assistance. Consequently, it's a delight to have with us this very knowledgeable and experienced panel, not only to inform us of the question of the current impact of events in Libya on the security environment in the Maghreb and the Sahel, but also point to likely trends that we'll face in the months and years ahead. This afternoon on our panel, delighted to have Geoff Porter, who's the president of North Africa Risk Consulting and an expert on the region, and the author of a soon-to-be released study on fault lines in North Africa. Mr. Fadel Lamen is the president of the American Libyan Council and an advisor both, which advises both the Libya's National Transitional Council, and himself personally is an advisor to the U.S. Department of Defense. We're very happy also to have Roger Peña with us. He's the Senior Legislative Assistant for Defense and Foreign Affairs to U.S. Senator Kay Hagan. And finally, Ambassador Ed Gabriel, former U.S. Ambassador to Morocco and a long-term time observer and friend of the region. And their full biographies are, of course, in the programs you have with you. So without further ado, I turn it over to the panel, beginning with Geoff, and look forward to their presentations and then their questions and dialogue afterwards.
Thank you. My mic on? And now it's live. Thank you, Peter. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here today about the ramifications of the conflict in Libya and the potential for continuing instability in Libya and elsewhere in the region. Peter asked me to speak broadly and to serve as sort of introductory comments to the more detailed analysis presented by my fellow panel members. So what I'd like to do is just give a general introduction to the instability in Libya and some of the consequences for the region, in particular looking at different stresses that the countries in the region are going to be facing as a consequence of what's taking place in Libya. You know, not to be overly dramatic, but I think it's possible to say that the region is in a state of flux and a state of uncertainty, a degree to which we haven't seen since the end of World War II, and then possibly the independence period in the 1950s when Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt became independent. Algeria followed in 1962. I'd like to leave aside Tunisia for the purposes of these discussions because Tunisia is still very much in flux. It's a very fast-moving target right now, and it's hard to identify where the country is going and what the potential problems there are. I think we could probably have an entire panel discussion devoted to Tunisia alone. So instead, what I'll do is begin with Libya, and then work my way clockwise around the region down to Niger, and then over to Mali, and then back up to Algeria. I won't be discussing Mauritania and Morocco. They seem to be sort of insulated from the immediate impact of what's taking place in Libya. I'd also like to provide a little bit of a caveat for my comments. What I'll be talking about is not intended to be an exhaustive list of the stresses that the countries are facing, Libya, Niger, Mali, and Algeria. But I'd like it to serve as a starting point for the discussion that my fellow panelists are most likely to engage in. So, beginning with Libya, obviously Libya is facing a full complement of stresses, whether it's economic, whether it's security, or whether it's political. There are a range of challenges that the new Libya is facing. Of the stresses, the economic stresses are perhaps the easiest to address. There's expectations that Libya is going to be able to increase its export capacity, which will generate, or hydrocarbon export capacity, which will generate revenue for the fledgling government. It's also likely that Libya will be able to rely upon its friends in the international community and the allies of the NTC for aid, either in the form of loans or in the form of direct aid to the country. The political problems that Libya is facing are considerably more challenging than the economic ones. Libya is having a difficult time forming a government, although they did hold successful elections not last 2 weekends ago. But even within the framework of those elections within the NTC, there's an intractable debate about how Libya should proceed with the allocation of portfolios and of representation within the new government. And it's facing all sorts of challenges regarding ethnic distribution, regional distribution, religious distribution, the degree to which Islamists should be included in the new government, the divisions about who was associated with the Gaddafi administration and who was in the opposition, who served in the opposition in exile, who served in the opposition under the Gaddafi administration or Gaddafi regime itself within Libya. I mean, these are intractable and very difficult problems to solve. For the moment, though, the NTC seems to be committed to adhering to a sort of neutral line. The preference seems to be to identify technocrats, mostly technocrats who have been in exile and haven't been in Libya for the last 30 years, in order to avoid exacerbating regional, ethnic, religious tensions. A good example of that is the new Prime Minister, El-Kib. El-Kib is a technocrat par excellence. He is ostensibly neutral. He has very little affiliation with either Libya itself or with the Gaddafi administration. And one of the problems of this approach seems to be that Libya and the NTC are avoiding the political hurdles that it's going to have to face in the future. And the longer that Libya avoids these political hurdles, the longer the tensions, the ethnic, religious, regional tensions will have to fester and to worsen, and the more difficult they will become the longer after Libya puts off addressing them. The security problem, which is the sort of overarching theme of this conference today, is also pretty significant. As we all know, and I think my colleague Mr. Lamen will discuss, there's been a tremendous amount of weapons proliferation in Libya, and I won't go into the details. They're all very well known, and I'm sure Mr. Lamen will share with us some new insights. One of the potential problems with the weapons proliferation, though, is that weapons are now in the hands of militias who are more or less aligned with the NTC and who may relinquish their weapons or may hold on to their weapons to guarantee greater political representation in the new government. This is a problem, and it's going to continue to be a problem. How we get the weapons out of the militias' hands, or how we incorporate the militias into a new Libyan military, how we demobilize the militias, is going to be a continuing problem for the foreseeable future. The weapons proliferation itself transcends Libya's borders, and this is the ripples that Peter was speaking about in the title of the conference. I mean, if we go southwards to Niger, Niger is also going to be bearing the brunt of the weapons proliferation coming out of Libya. But Niger faces other stresses as well. In particular, there's a humanitarian stress. Niger is currently hosting about 200,000 refugees or returnees from Libya. Some of these are Nigerian, some of these are refugees or returnees from other Sahelian or sub-Saharan African countries that have gotten stuck in Niger. Food security is always a problem in Niger. There are limited water resources, there are limited food resources. The addition of 200,000 people puts a tremendous amount of stress on the food resources and water resources, which has the potential to cause some instability in the north of the country. An additional stress for Niger is the loss of remittances coming out of Libya. The Nigerian workers that were in Libya would send remittances home and serve to augment a fairly anemic economy in Niger itself. Those remittances aren't likely to return anytime soon. And it's possible that the Nigerian won't be welcomed back into a new Libya to contribute to the rebuilding of the country. So it's in fact possible that those remittances are gone forever, which poses a real economic hardship for Niger. And then lastly, Niger is also struggling under the burden of Saadi al-Gaddafi and Sanusi, Gaddafi's intelligence chief, who are ostensibly still in Niger. Niger has tried to reach out to the NTC to seek some sort of solution to Saadi's situation, and the NTC hasn't been very receptive to the Nigerians' overtures. So Saadi is still in the country, and Niger is still trying to figure out what to do with him, and it's a burden that they just don't want to shoulder, and they feel has been unjustly thrust upon them. So, that brings us to Mali. Mali is also struggling with an exodus out of Libya. And in the Malian case, the exodus is of some 2,000 fighters who quit the fight several days before Gaddafi's death. These were pro-Gaddafi fighters. They are, in the words of somebody at the State Department that I spoke to earlier today, battle-hardened. They're well-equipped. They are well-trained, perhaps better equipped, better trained, and more battle-hardened than the Malian army itself. So this poses a potential problem in the north of Mali. It's an open question what's going to happen with these fighters. It's possible that the fighters will align with the Tuareg in the north. The Tuareg in the north of Mali have been a source of instability and a source of rebellion over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. And it waxes and wanes. Where the Tuaregs rebel, they sue for peace. They burn through the cash that they sued for. They rebel again. They sue for peace again. They burn through the cash and so on. And you have this cyclical nature. It's possible that the returning fighters from Libya will join up with the Tuareg, which will allow the Tuareg to extract a higher price for suing for peace. It's also possible that the fighters returning from Libya will join up with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic, the Maghreb Islamique, the Islamic Maghreb. I think that's less likely, but it's certainly a possibility. And then lastly, there is the possibility that the Malians will be able to incorporate returning fighters from Libya into the regular Malian army. I think this is the least likely possibility, but it's certainly the best option out there. So for the foreseeable future, I think the presence of returning fighters from Libya in Mali is going to be a wild card in the north and poses a threat to stability and security there. Now, the big question, the sort of the $100,000 question that everybody's thinking about is Algeria and weapons proliferation also poses a threat for Algeria. You know, I had always said that up until about January 2011, Algeria had ceased to be a security story. Algeria had largely eradicated AQIM. AQIM was constrained to, under the leadership of Abdelmalik Drukdel up in the north, was constrained to the Tizi Ouzou region, to the Boumerdis Mountains. It was a largely ineffective group. Unfortunately, because of what's happened in Libya, the collapse of the Gaddafi government and the proliferation of weapons out of Libya, Algeria is once again a security story. And this is just a cold reality. Since the bloodshed of the 1990s that sort of enveloped Algeria, Algeria had instituted some pretty strict gun control laws. It's very difficult to get a hold of a weapon in Algeria. So much so that in the 1990s, the Algerian state seized the hunting rifles of private citizens. And I was in a meeting back in 2009 with the former head of national security, where an Algerian was beseeching him to get his hunting rifle back. So the hunting rifles still have not been returned, and it's a very, very tight environment. The weapons proliferation coming out of Libya has dramatically changed that, and it's probably going to become much easier if you had the inclination to get a hold of a weapon in Algeria now than it was at the same time last year. Algeria shares a 1,000-kilometer border with Libya. It's the longest border with Libya apart from Egypt, and we can talk about weapons proliferation and the consequences of that going eastwards as well. Algeria is struggling to bolster its border security. It has a tremendous amount of capability in terms of manpower, but it is also dealing with a tremendous territory. One province in southern Algeria, the throwaway figure, is the same size as France, the Hagan. Algeria itself, geographically, is 4 times as large as France. The other throwaway figure that I'd like to use is that Algeria's largest southernmost city, Tamanrasset, is farther from Algiers than Algiers is from London. It's a big country, and it poses significant policing problems, just the sheer size of it. So, I think that while the weapons proliferation in the region poses a problem for all the countries, for Niger, for Mali, for Algeria, I think the problems are probably most acute for Algeria itself. Now, let me explain why. AQIM, as we know, and anybody who studied it knows, is a fractured group. It's divided into primarily 3 different factions. One is led by Abdelmalik Drukdel up in the north, in the Boumerdis Mountains, the Tizi Ouzou region. The other is led by Abdelhamid Abu Zaid in the south. And then there's another southern group beyond Algeria's borders led by Muqtada al-Muqtar. Drukdel's group still seems to be committed to Salafi jihadi ideology. It still has a political agenda. It still has a grievance against the Algerian state. It still has a grievance against people who are supposedly not Muslim enough. And it still carries out attacks against Algerian security services, but in fact with some regularity. The 2 southern groups, led by Muqtada al-Muqtar and Abdelhamid Abu Zaid, seem to be less and less committed to Salafi jihadi ideology and more committed to sheer criminal enterprises. They've become mafias. The acts that they undertake don't seem to advance any Salafi jihadi goal, and they don't seem to espouse much Salafi jihadi ideology in the messages that they put out, which have become less and less frequent. So, were any of the were AQIM to try and benefit from weapons proliferation coming out of Algeria, the group that would most likely use those weapons to carry out attacks would be Drukdel's group in the north. And those attacks would target the Algerian state and representatives of the security services and possibly foreign installations associated with foreign personnel or foreign workers. That poses a serious threat. And I think there's a high degree of likelihood that Drukdel is going to try to benefit from weapons proliferation and try to augment its capabilities in the north of the country. And that's a challenge for the Algerian state. I think the southern groups are less likely to pose a threat, even in light of weapons proliferation. And this is because of their evolution away from terrorism or a politically motivated terrorism and towards organized crime. There are 3 possibilities for what the southern groups led by al-Muqtar and Abu Zaid can do with those weapons. The first possibility is they use them for offensive purposes, the second is they use them for defensive purposes, and the third is simply that they monetize them and sell them. If we extrapolate from the southern group's current trajectory, this evolution towards organized crime, it's unlikely that even were the southern groups to acquire weapons coming out of Libya, that they would use them for offensive purposes. In fact, if we look at the pattern of attacks that AQIM in the south has carried out over the last couple of years, they haven't been for offensive purposes. When they have used weapons for offensive purposes, it's been retaliatory. It's been retaliation against states that have infringed upon their quote-unquote territory. So sticking within this framework of conceiving of these groups as mafias or criminal organizations rather than terrorist organizations, it's possible then that the southern groups would acquire weapons and use them to bolster their defensive capabilities, right? That they would acquire weapons in order to discourage states, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Algeria, France, the United States, from interfering in their activities that they're undertaking in northern Mali or in northern Niger. And it becomes more and more difficult for states to try and disrupt those activities. And if we think about it in the framework of kidnap and ransom, the better capabilities AQIM has in the south, the higher a ransom fee they can charge for the release of a kidnap, a hostage, right? It removes the military option from the table, and the states will then have to pay. The last possibility is that AQIM in the south simply monetizes the weapons. AQIM seems to be, in the south, seems to be privileging money over just about anything else. And they simply may become brokers for weapons going into other armed conflict zones in Western Africa or elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that's a distinct possibility as well. So, my last comment, and this probably is rudimentary, it goes without saying, but what is certain is that the influx of a tremendous amount of weapons into a poorly policed territory that has a history of well-known violent non-state actors is going to be a potent mix. And there's certainly going to be consequences from this. Some of these will be unexpected, but others are easier to anticipate. One is, I think, the likelihood of attacks in northern Algeria. And then in the south, I think we're going to see a heightened amount of insecurity, and how that insecurity manifests itself over the next couple of years remains to be seen. So I'll leave it with that and turn it over to my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoff, for that tour d'horizon. And now we turn immediately to Mr. Fadel.
Thank you very much. My phone is working, I hope. Of course, it's really hard to add to what you said in terms of the overall picture. I will be focusing on Libya, and I will give you a little bit of a Libyan perspective on what's going on in Libya and what are the different forces and key players in Libya. The reason I'm focusing on that to help you understand the stability in Libya will help dampen some of the concerns that Geoff was talking about, and maybe help secure the region a little bit more. There are more problems in Libya. The lack of security and stability in the country will lead to more lack of stability and security in the region, and maybe even some kind of a civil war in the country itself. So I will tour with you through the main key players in Libya and who has the weapons in Libya, and we'll talk a little bit about the future and where the guns or weapons in Libya, who have them, as well as how the Libyans see the relations with the neighboring countries. So, what's going on in Libya? I mean, let's talk about the key players. You hear a lot about the NTC and government, transition government, and so on and so forth. Within the NTC itself, there are more than one group, and there are the Islamists and there are the liberal non-Islamists, that compose of secularists or liberals or all the non-Islamists. And there is some kind of power struggle, and this power struggle between these two major groups, it's causing the NTC to become less effective and unable to make a lot of tough decisions. Coupled with the inability of the NTC to communicate effectively with the rest of the population, it is making its job more difficult when it comes to or try to deal with the militias and people who have the weapons inside the country. And that's one of the major problems. They have not been able to carry the majority of the population with them due to lack of communication, lack of clarity of the message and direction. Of course, there is so much pressure on them from both the populace, the Libyans, and from the international community to speed up the process and cook something very quickly, come up with an election, because we reduce the whole democracy in a form of a quick election, when we've seen some of the problems with quick elections in Iraq and in other countries. So there are, and they are trying to do that at the same time to gain some kind of legitimacy in the eyes of the Libyan people. So they are in a very tough position right now. Looking at this liberal, for example, who are they? We can look at some of them. They are coming from abroad. They used to be. They are Libyan from the diaspora. Some of them are former leftist and nationalist and Arabists who are not anymore, and they're becoming more ideological and less ideological and more democratic in that sense. Some of them are former pro-Gaddafi loyalists too. So here are this group of people. So while they are not just one group of people, they are mixed. So how close the relationship between the Libyans from the diaspora to the former Gaddafi loyalists? Of course, there is tension. The same thing with the others. As far as the Islamists, we hear a lot about the Islamists. They are not just one group. We have the Muslim Brotherhood as a group, and even the Muslim Brotherhood in Libya. It is not just one group in terms of how it is the thinking within the group itself, or the view of self and the world. Some of them, they are coming from who lived outside of the country or from the diaspora. They are usually exposed to democracy values and all Western values and so on and so forth. They tend to be a little bit more liberal. Others, they were in prison for quite some time, and you know what prison does to people. It hardens their views. They can be more conservative, and some of them are younger. They are more impacted by the jihadist or more extremist views that they can see and read in the internet, and so it's a mixed bag with that. We have also the among the Islamists, the former fighting group. Did they give up their ideology, or they're conveniently changing it tactically? Nobody knows. There are some former jihadists. As I said, some of them also impacted by some who came from Iraq, others who were exposed to the propaganda through the internet and the online activities by extremist groups. And we also have a very interesting group of people that was more or less imported by Gaddafi and promoted by Gaddafi, the Salafists, the typical traditional Salafists that are more or less coming, what we see in Saudi Arabia. Gaddafi, in the last few years, promoted that thinking, because it says that you cannot oppose the regime, you cannot oppose the head of the regime, because he is the leader. You have to give him you have to pay him, you have to be patient with him, you cannot oppose him, and you cannot you cannot rebel against him. So that kind of thinking, it developed some traction within the country. With that, came some traction or some kind of it resonated with certain segment of the population in Libya. So we have. You can see the cover, the way the Saudi style cover. You can see the way or the thinking, even with the former Gaddafis who stood with Gaddafi in the last 10 months or so. They quoted some of the Saudi sheikhs when it comes why they stood with Gaddafi, because he is the leader, he is the imam, he is the person that we should not repel against. So, and that's another dimension we have to keep in mind. So, looking at those, with that we have also the former regime bureaucrats, we have the former regime fighters who fought with the regime. What will happen to them? That will lead me to the issue of reconciliation. How successful the reconciliation will be will determine if Libya will have a smooth transition or a possibility of civil war. If we cannot, ultimately after what happened in Sirte, which is the city was completely devastated, and people were very, very angry about that, and the former fighters, if they were not, if the government is not able to absorb them and compensate them and work them. If they were excluded in a sense, where would they go? If they have no seat at the table, they will go and create their own table, and they have the training, they have the access probably to weapons, and they can cause not just problems to the neighbors, but they can create problems within the country itself. So exclusion can be a big issue for those. I think everybody knows the issue of weapons and the unguarded weapons. The reports are all over the place. 20,000 manpad have been unaccounted for. Chemical weapons, poison gases, and you name it is there in Libya. Gaddafi in the last 40 years, he spent so much. If there is something to spend in Libya, he spent buying weapons and ammunition in Libya. And meanwhile, these weapons are not very sophisticated in a sense, you know, the old tanks, but even the small, very unsophisticated weapons, they can be used for IEDs and other dangerous detonating, whatever we call it, IEDs. Looking at the militias, who are these fighters? Who are these fighters? Who are in the militia in Libya? They are students, they are employees, and they are unemployed people. So what will happen to them will determine if they are students and they will be able to go back to school. Usually they are university students or high school students. Universities have not started yet, and they have been having difficulty starting universities. So if the schools have not started, then where would they go? The longer it takes, the longer the difficult will be, the more in love with their weapons they will be, and the harder for them to give them up, because they give them some kind of presence, they give them some kind of power, recognition, and you name it. The employees who used to work somewhere, can they go back to their jobs? Where were their jobs? They are the companies, they are government institutions. Are the government institutions functioning or not? Are these companies are functioning and back to work and be able to absorb these staff and will be able to pay them? That's another issue. Libya is still suffering from all the talk about the money, that there is hundreds of billions of dollars in frozen assets. The Libyan officials until today and yesterday that I talked to, they said they haven't received much of anything. So we know how difficult to unfreeze the assets. You know, to tell a bank that you have to give up the billions of dollars that they get a good interest on. I think it may take some of these assets. We know from history that some of the assets since World War II, they have not released by some banks until now. So it can be very difficult to tell people give back the money that they use for investment and for a good return. The third group of people are the unemployed, which is the unemployment in Libya is over 35% during Gaddafi, and I think right now it's almost up to 50 to 60%. Can the government offer jobs? What kind of jobs? Will they be able to pay them? can they absorb them in the police and the military? Do they want to be absorbed in the police and the military? Can they be trained? These are issues I think Iraq faced too. And when they try to absorb the militias into the armed forces and security forces and end up creating militias inside these institutions with mixed loyalty and conflicted loyalty sometimes within these organizations. So that's another challenge. Weapons, Gaddafi weapons we have, they are scattered all over the country. As Geoff was talking about Algeria, I think Libya is as I think it's not as large as Algeria, but very close. So in that sense, it's very, Gaddafi used very different areas to store these weapons all over the countries. Most of these areas are not secured. So what happened is some of the militias, and I'm going to talk about the militias in Misrata, for example. It has been recognized in the last few months that they've been acquiring and stockpiling a lot of weapons in the city, to the point that people said, well, are they going to create their own army, or are they going to declare independence? Or are they going to use this part of as a negotiating card with the government, with the NTC and the future governments? So there are, while we may think that a lot of the weapons are going out of Libya, there are weapons that have been acquired by certain militias to strengthen themselves, which is in itself, while it may be good news for the neighboring countries that they are not getting these weapons, but it's not good news for the Libyans, because it is used to strengthen certain militias who may have certain design. Some of the weapons are in the hands of the fighters. Some of the weapons, as I said, in the hands of the local councils, military councils, like the one in Misrata I just mentioned. They are in the hands of the militias. Some of the weapons are in the market. They are sold. As a matter of fact, the AK-47, it went from almost 3,000 Libyan dinars to less than 2,000 dinars. I don't know why, but it seems that more people are selling them because the war is over, maybe because they needed money. So there is a flood of weapons within in the market in Libya. Some of these weapons, as Geoff was saying, that are trafficked to neighboring countries, business. There is nothing, it's not ideological, they're just, people are making money. It went, some of these weapons went to Egypt. There were some serious problems and issues the Egyptians faced with that, and a few times they closed the borders, they required visas. We know that in Egypt there were a lot of smugglers in that region, certain tribes that are typically traditionally involved in smuggling, and they were happy to receive these weapons. As I said, locals also selling their weapons for money. There is a problem between the different cities. While we're talking about the coastal cities and the regions, there are some the cities in the south. How are the level of their loyalty to the NTC itself? How close are their relationship to the rest of the cities in the north, and how close they are to border cities in other countries like Niger and Chad and Algeria too. We know that there are some of the cities that are closer to the major cities in Algeria or Niger or Chad than they are closer to Tripoli. And the traditional divide and conquer policy of Gaddafi, creating alliances closer to the borders, especially with the Tuareg, is a very serious thing that we have to consider. So it will continue to be the lack of funds. The frozen asset will be one of the major issues the Libyan government offered a couple of programs to buy these weapons, but they didn't have the money to pay for these weapons that they are offering to buy. So there is a serious shortage in funds, and I think for policy makers and decision makers here and takers here, they have to understand without releasing these assets to enable the Libyan government to implement these programs, we are participating indirectly in the proliferation of these weapons outside the country, hence this instability of the regions. The future relations between Libya and the other countries. Tunisia is the closest, the dearest. Libyans are in love with Tunisia. Tunisians are in love with the Libyans. I don't know. They're going to marry soon. Algeria, no. I think there is some issues between the two countries. There are some hurt and bad feelings between the Libyans and Algerians. The Libyans feel that the Algerians have been supporting Gaddafi, and they supported Gaddafi, and they channeled a lot of the mercenaries through Algeria and weapons and so on and so forth. Algeria feels that the Libyans never cared about the security concern of Algeria. They have a pact with Gaddafi. It's a security pact. He was helping in securing Algeria and fighting the terrorism without, they looked at him as a reliable partner more than they looked at the Libyan people as future reliable partner. Now we're having an issue. As far as Egypt is, they are cautiously closer to Libya. Chad, I think, as far as the African countries, and I think that this is one of the major problems. Libya and NTC and the leadership have not developed a view or a policy toward Africa. There is that feeling that we don't want to deal with Africa. We're not Africa anymore. We're looking north. Of course, typically, historically, Libya always part of the north more than it was part of the south. It was Gaddafi who pulled Libya back toward Africa for his grandiose, hopes and leadership that he thought that he may project leadership in Africa. But historically, Libya has more ties with the north of the Mediterranean than it has with the south. But the question is, during Gaddafi, there was 42 years of investment that Gaddafi invested in Africa. Should it be squandered or left? And I posed this question to a couple of the NTC people, and they said, well, he really did not invest in Africa. He invested in some of the corrupt leaders of African leaders. He used to pay them. So did this money go to the African people? Is there a good investment, solid investment between the Libyan people and Libya and the African people from different countries? Or it was a relationship between leaders at the top level where they used to receive a paycheck from Gaddafi? And if that's the case, I mean, there's nothing, the relationship between Libya and the African countries, it has to be redefined and rebuilt in the future. Libya will become very closer to Morocco. Algeria will continue to be an issue, and I think there is some kind of frozen relationship there, and I don't see that there will be some kind of good rapprochement in the future, and Geoff can comment on that. The other interesting thing is Libyans are calling for the Egyptian workers to come back, but that they are not interested in having the African workers coming back at all. And that may help the countries north of the Mediterranean. So the illegal immigration will be less of a problem, since no African workers will be in Libya trying to cross. But it will be a problem for these African countries who, as Geoff was saying, they relied on remittances coming from their workers to the region from Libya, that they can send from Libya to their own countries. So Libya may focus more on workers from the Arab countries. Probably they will have more coming from Morocco and Tunisia and Egypt. So that will be the direction that Libya will be looking at the African countries as who supported the revolution, who supported Gaddafi, who supported the regimes against the people. And I think that's their view of the relationship. It's very basic. It's not sophisticated right now because there are a lot of emotions involved in this view. But I think as things will settle down, probably we'll see more sophisticated, more realistic, pragmatic view, especially when it comes to Niger, Mali, and Chad, our closest country, and the stability of this country will impact the stability of the Libyan society and the country itself. And I will stop.
Thank you very much for that perspective, and it gave us quite a number of things that I'm sure will come up in the discussion. And we turn now to Roger.
Thanks, Peter. I just want to add the caveat that, again, my remarks are really my opinions and insight and not attributable to Senator Hagan. Today I'll be discussing U.S. efforts, especially in the security front, concentrating on efforts to deter emerging threats in the region, in the Maghreb and the Sahel. As everyone knows, the situation in Libya raises serious concerns about man pads, the proliferation of explosive ordnance that can be converted to improvised explosive devices, and other weapons falling into the hands of militants operating in the Maghreb and Sahel. Moreover, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb seeks to posture itself to take advantage of the political dynamics in the North African region, with unrest stretching from the Sinai to the Sahara. This is a strategic opportunity for them which they are attempting to exploit. Compounding the problem is the emergence of a nexus between three African terrorist groups: Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, operating in North Africa and Sahel region, and Boko Haram in Nigeria. Another contributing factor are the regional mercenaries that serve as conduits to the narco-trafficking trade routes, as well as enablers in kidnapping for ransom that sustain terrorist organizations. For the next few minutes, I'll discuss the nexus and/or convergence of terrorist organizations in the region, U.S. security cooperation and security assistance initiatives, particularly in the Sahel region, description of the types of security cooperation mechanisms and authorities we utilize in a whole-of-government approach, and the required resources we need to meet the emerging threats. So let me start off with the nexus of convergence of terrorist organizations and actors. According to General Carter Ham, Geographical Commander of U.S. Africa Command, those three terrorist organizations, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and AQIM, seem to be intent on synchronizing their networks to attack U.S. and Western interests in the region. There is also a concern that Boko Haram has actual operational links with AQIM. To what extent that they share tactics, techniques, and procedures remains to be seen. There are other actors as well that are actively collaborating with terrorist groups. For example, some radical elements among the Tuareg rebels in Mali, Mauritania, Niger, and southern Algeria have cooperated with AQIM in smuggling and other activities. Additionally, there are reported ties, the extent to which has to be fully investigated, between AQIM and elements of the Polisario in refugee camps in Algeria. The likely link is largely monetarily incentivized. A few weeks ago, as we all know, AQIM kidnapped an Italian and two Spanish aid workers from the Polisario-run refugee camps. It is alleged that Polisario Front members who may have supplied the insurgents with weapons and directions to the victims reportedly assisted in the abduction. Any efforts underway for AQIM to establish or expand ties with the Polisario Front would come as little surprise, as it feeds right into AQIM's tactics, techniques, and procedures of raising operational funds through kidnappings for ransom. As you know, AQIM has had a history of outsourcing abductions to other mercenary armed groups in the desert. Moreover, conditions for Saharans living in Polisario camps is potentially conducive for AQIM to exploit, utilizing the young population as either mercenaries to facilitate kidnappings for ransom money or radicalize militants to become actual operatives. That is why regional economic, political, military, and social change in the region is fundamentally needed. However, major impediments to this are the attractiveness and pervasiveness of weapons and drug smuggling in the Maghreb and Sahel, and the lack of effective regional cooperation between countries, most notably the continuing impasse between Morocco and Algeria over the status of Western Sahara and the Polisario Front. I want to shift gears a little bit into discussion of security cooperation mechanisms that we utilize, and to combat these emerging threats to our national security interests and regional stability, the U.S. government is engaged in multi-year security cooperation and security assistance initiatives with countries in the region. One particular example in terms of the intelligence community that can utilize to help foster and increase the capacity of these regional governments' intelligence capability is fusion. Fusion between signals intelligence and human intelligence to enable decisive direct action, special operations, or commando operations against targeted militants. Among the objectives of security cooperation activities is to disrupt AQIM operations and prevent them from mobilizing into a coherent, organized, large-scale threat. The objective of the U.S. is not necessarily to defeat all AQIM cells throughout the Sahel, Sahara, and North Africa, but rather to build partnership capacity for other countries to do that. Especially in these tough economic times, and the Congress is currently deliberating appropriations bills, we look for, I don't want to say the path of least resistance, but what is more economic. U.S. training and equipping initiatives in foreign countries in the region are focused on disrupting militant elements within their borders. The U.S. also aims to maintain a light or transient presence to unilaterally engage militants in West Africa, should it be called upon to do so. For example, U.S. efforts in West Africa have made it likely that local military forces can locate and disrupt them. The training and equipment given to African military forces in the Sahel have subjected AQIM and other militant elements to persistent probing attacks aimed to disrupt their ability to mobilize. Recent pressure by the governments of Mauritania and Mali against AQIM units in the Sahel region have caused militants to flee with significant loss of materiel. The Department of Defense, through congressionally directed authorities provided to the Department of State, executes a variety of U.S. security cooperation involvement in the region. Normally as well, the CIA and Department of State also have substantial engagements on their own with governments in the Maghreb and Sahel. The preponderance of U.S. counterterrorism efforts in the Sahel is focused on Mauritania, Mali, and to a lesser extent, Niger. Coincidentally, these countries are less capable of engaging AQIM across the Sahel front, lacking effective counterterrorism capabilities. Let's switch gears a little bit to Mauritania and just describe some of these security cooperation initiatives we have there. One of our closest partners in the Sahel, U.S. forces support Mauritanian ground and air forces and contribute to operational and logistical activities. U.S. assistance to Mauritania's special forces includes training exercises and the provision of guns, ammunition, vehicles, radios, and uniforms to ensure units are capable of executing the missions that they were trained to do. Mauritania's special forces have a few units trained specifically for military operations. Their first tier is the best trained counterterrorism unit in the country, created and trained by U.S. Special Operations Forces. Another unit is a peacekeeping unit that has received training through the Department of State's Africa Contingency Operations Training and Assistance Program. U.S. is also working to boost Mauritania's indigenous intelligence gathering and analytical capability. We're also helping refurbish a forward operating base near the Malayan border, which will give the Mauritanians a forward-based intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability to be able to facilitate troops' transportability and direct action missions. In terms of Mali, they've received significant amounts of funds from the United States government. In particular, Mali wants to assign 2 counterterrorism units to a refurbished military base and to 2 other minor outposts in the desert which can serve as bases, allowing units to conduct regular patrols. We have given the Malayan forces truck transport, communication radios and radio systems, fuel, food, and also medical supplies for their respective soldiers. U.S. Special Operations Forces are also training Malayan units, which are small mobile task forces comprising regular Army troops and irregular fighters from northern militias. These units are preferred to engaging against AQIM threats and have a good track record against them. The U.S. is also implementing a military intelligence train and equip program in Mali, and it includes the creation of an analytical cell and funding for several aircraft to be utilized for surveillance and intelligence gathering. In terms of Niger, we have also extensive bilateral relationships in terms of security cooperation-wise with that particular country. It's included training one special operations capable counterterrorism unit with plans to train another. And the U.S. is also offering training in police forensics, assisting in the creation of a military intelligence unit, and a national intelligence fusion center, helping to refurbish a forward airlift base and providing equipment to improve communications between Niger and Algeria. Outside Mauritania, Mali, and Niger. Other countries receive limited U.S. security cooperation. Senegal, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad are important to counterterrorism efforts in West Africa, but are not the focus of U.S. military assistance. Switching gears a little bit and talking to address the actual toolkit that I like to describe of security cooperation mechanisms we use to leverage. And there are a variety of them. If you're a Special Operations Forces operator, one thing that's utilized a lot is the Joint Combined Exchange Training Program, or JCETS, which are exercises, bilateral most of the time, sometimes multilateral, to provide training opportunities for our U.S. Special Forces to engage with partners with the sole purpose of enabling partnership capacity for them to do the things that is in their best regional interests. Another tool we utilize is known as 1206 Train and Equip Authority in the National Defense Authorization Act to build partnership capacity with foreign militaries. It ensures that the Secretary of Defense has the authority to train and equip foreign military forces for the purpose of conducting counterterrorism and stability operations. Another provision of the National Defense Authorization Act is the extension of 1208 authority for U.S. Special Operations Forces to train and equip regular and irregular indigenous forces for counterterrorism operations. Quite oftentimes in the congressionally appropriated bills, which will be taken up this week, hopefully, is foreign military finance allocations or grant allocations to certain countries. And this particular grant allocations does a variety of different things. More commonly, it's used to buy U.S.-oriented equipment through the Foreign Military Sales Program, in which the money comes back to the United States, and usually industry mobilizes what they need to be able to service the actual need of that foreign military, conducive with Arms Export Control Act provisions in Congress. There's also international military education and training initiatives that we have with a variety of the different countries in the region, where they come to the United States and particularly to U.S. Military garrisons and installations to learn the way of life in terms of our troops and how they're trained, and of course being able to subject through civilian authority, and at the same time to abide by Leahy vetting and humanitarian types of initiatives and regulations. A key enabling mission performed by U.S. Special Operations Forces is what's called Foreign Internal Defense. And in Foreign Internal Defense is basically your Green Berets. These are the guys that go in, train a particular battalion or a brigade or what have you, to be able to exchange tactics, techniques, and procedures, and to be able to operate effectively against a common threat. And again, it becomes such engagement as adopted most effectively by AFRICOM is also extremely economical, and it's something that we utilize very, very much. Counterterrorism also refers to actions taken directly against terrorist networks and indirectly to influence and render global and regional environments. Counterterrorism, I want to make sure there's an understanding, counterterrorism prize are killing bad people. Those are the high-value targets. Counterinsurgency operations, the prize is the actual populace. So you have military information security operations, you have a lot of Department of State sponsored mechanisms to leverage and affect the populace so that that way it can be rendered unradicalized as much as possible. AFRICOM executes a variety of different programs focused in the actual region, most notably Operation Enduring Freedom Trans-Sahara, which is the U.S. government's regional war on terrorism operation and provides military support to the Department of State-led Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership. The Department of State overarching umbrella initiative is developed to address potential expansion of operations by terrorist and extremist organizations across West and North Africa. And AFRICOM has, in many ways, the kinetic piece towards that. And different engagement is required for AFRICOM to facilitate that program. Different partnerships with 11 African nations, Algeria, Libya, Morocco, and the countries in the Sahel being notable. A top priority for AFRICOM is increasing multilateral partner support to build upon existing African regional coalitions, such as the African Union and Economic Community of Western African States. The problem is that what we run into, and what AFRICOM runs into in particular, is the issue of regional cooperation, multilateral cooperation. Because it's easy to engage with the country bilaterally and to agree, in principle at least, the mutual objectives and the objectives that we want to facilitate. And as someone once told me, the goal of U.S. foreign policy is to do what you want their way. And it's difficult to do that when you have very many partners, particularly when you have a lot of showstoppers, most notably the impasse between Algeria and Morocco, the historical impasse that needs to be addressed, quite frankly, in my humble opinion, tangibly in order to be able to progress on the social, political, economic, and military dimensions. Another initiative in security cooperation that quite oftentimes is not spoken about enough, in my opinion, is counter-narcotics. And through its geographical commands, the military departments and agencies provide unique platforms, personnel, systems, and capabilities that support federal law enforcement agencies and foreign security forces involved in particular counter-narcotics missions. Most notable efforts include helping countries build their capacity to confront the drug trafficking. DoD counter-narcotics mission targets those terrorist groups worldwide that use narcotics trafficking to support terrorist activities. The goal is to prevent terrorists benefiting from illicit drug revenue and smuggling networks. Most DoD counter-narcotics programs are funded through the DoD Counter-Narcotics Central Transfer Account, which is within the appropriations bill. DoD senior personnel have traveled to West Africa to obtain a better understanding of the region where, as you know, weak governance is exploited by drug traffickers as they target the worldwide market for cocaine. Drug trafficking has become also a global phenomenon. You also have organizations known as transnational criminal organizations that are not necessarily terrorist organizations, but work in partnership with terrorist organizations to facilitate drug smuggling and weapons networks. And they're becoming increasingly pervasive in the region. These relationships range from tactical, episodic interactions at one end of the spectrum to full narco-terrorism on the other. This threat networking also undermines legitimate institutions in ways that create opportunities for other threats. Transnational criminal organizations are increasingly diversifying into other forms of criminal activity in order to spread risk and maximize potential profit. In some regions, for example, drug trafficking organizations also engage in kidnapping, armed robbery, extortion, financial crime, and or other activities. The last comment that I'll end before I pass it on to my next colleague is the actual required assets that the United States government needs to be able to continue to monitor emerging threats. And most notably, they're the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, drones being just one of those ISR assets. And particularly difficult right now in the African theater, in particular North Africa, West Africa, and the Sahel, is that the preponderance of our ISR assets is really focused on Afghanistan, Iraq, which is now being drawn down significantly to the point where we're not going to have any conventional forces there present, and also the Yemen-Somali theater. So General Carter Ham has a very difficult task right now to be able to, in light of fiscal constraints and limited DoD resources to project power, we're going to have to make a strong case for the continuance of ISR assets, which were utilized extensively in the Libya operation with coalition partners. But it's going to be interesting to see, especially when you have the issue of transnational criminal organizations as well as terrorist organizations and the different actors that are playing along with very many, I don't want to call them necessarily mercenaries, but different types of individuals and organizations that are working not necessarily in line with terrorists, but are facilitating their objectives through working with their means. So that being said.
Thank you very much, Roger, for that presentation, and gives us some concrete policy issues to look at in our discussion. And now our last panelist, Ambassador Gabriel.
Thank you, Peter, and what a great panel you put together. Another great forum here at the Atlantic Council. Just to acknowledge these great people that are here. Geoff Porter is actually the expert for the experts, so we're really glad to have you here. Fadel, it says a lot that NTC has asked you to advise them because of your great background. Also, I like your taste in ties. And I would add one other thing. Save some of those marriages for Moroccans. I thought there was a love-in between Morocco and Libya as well as Tunisia, so we have a lot of cousins that might qualify. And of course, Roger, who is the advisor to Senator Hagan, one of the most thoughtful senators on defense and foreign policy. You know, a year ago, we wouldn't be thinking about what's happening today in the foreign policy arena and what the State Department and the other agencies are doing, trying to play catch-up on U.S. Foreign policy and what to do. And I think we're confronted, all of us, with that thinking process. I don't think a year ago we would have seen the dynamics that are happening. The Saudi-Syria dynamic with Turkey in the middle of this whole situation, siding with Saudi and probably behind the scenes doing a lot to undermine the Syrian ambitions. You've got Democrats, small d Democrats, you called them liberals earlier, that created a lot of this movement, and you're seeing Islamists winning the elections. There's that dynamic going on, which is awfully interesting, and it bodes on the North Africa part as well. You've got the whole Arab Spring question that's affecting whether or not there's a post-jihadist period. From listening to my colleagues this morning, I don't think we would think that. But there is a growing body of literature out there that's talking about whether or not the Arab Spring is producing this post-jihadist movement. And then you've got, and we wouldn't have said this a year ago, the stability of the monarchs versus dictatorships. These are all dynamics going on. Today I'd just like to focus a few words on more specific things that I could add to what you've already talked about. And I can't add much, but I'll add a few things. I like to focus on three critical elements. One, the opportunities for an effective regional cooperation in security and economic development that can't be missed going forward. Second, the reduction of conditions emanating from terrorist threats, so well described by you all. And finally, specific policy recommendations that the U.S. government should be thinking about when it comes to security cooperation and enabling an environment conducive to greater regional stability and progress. There are two takeaways I'd like you to have today by the time I end my talk. One is, it's in America's interest to find a way to create cooperation among the countries of the North African region. Roger said it, I'm not going to dwell on it, but the most important thing we could do is use our resources and our ability to create more cooperation for common interest, both in the security and economic areas and political areas. The second takeaway I would give you is this is going to be a problem given the fact that we've got a great instability in the southern part of Algeria and the refugee camps there. The Polisario have been holding refugees in these camps for over 30 years. We've got to use this as an opportunity now to solve this Western Sahara problem. And it would behoove the international community to find a solution to bring Algeria and Morocco together to solve this on a win-win solution between them. So those will be the two takeaways I hope you take from this. Despite the weapons proliferation coming from Libya that you all talked about, Algeria and Morocco, in my opinion, seem to have a rather effective counter-terrorism regime in place. Having said that, the Inter-University Center on Terrorism Studies at the Potomac Institute does indicate that terrorism is on the rise in North Africa and the Sahel, and particularly in Algeria. The terrorism incidents in Algeria is somewhere between 70 and 90% of all terrorism incidents in the region. So there's a really important nexus here in terms of how we work with Algeria. For its part, the U.S. does not seem to have a coherent and inclusive counterterrorism plan for the region due to a couple of reasons. One, we're dealing bilaterally with Morocco and Algeria and some of the other countries. Roger mentioned Mauritania and others. Algeria then has a regional effort that excludes Morocco and works with the U.S. And then it has another regional effort that's working with some countries and it excludes the United States. France has an interest. The U.S. and France have to come together using their influence and their equipment to help create more of a regional opportunity. It really inhibits effective monitoring in the pursuit of terrorists, and it'll encourage tactics by terrorists and insurgents who are well aware of the soft spots in this counterterrorism network. Add to this that the border is closed between Algeria and Morocco. Morocco has offered on several occasions to open that border and have more cooperation, to no avail. It's now in America's interest and the international community's interest to find a common policy moving forward and a dialogue moving forward that addresses this issue. And it really, if I had talked to you 2 weeks ago, you might question some of the facts and figures I threw out, especially when I mentioned the Polisario. But let's face it, there was an abduction last week in the Polisario camps. Most articles that I've read implicate elements of the Polisario in cooperating in the Rabuni camp, which is the most protected camp of these refugees, protected by the Polisario and Algeria. How did these guys get in there and find these people and take them out without some cooperation? These are pretty serious allegations that the press is making, but they're not the first allegations that have been made about this problem of these refugees and the Polisario elements involved in narcotics, and terrorism activities, complicity by various countries to let them go into Libya and fight against the NATO forces. Now, in response to this latest incident, the UN and others have issued a strict guideline for operations for the Polisario. And we have to think that this coordination among the security forces, or lack thereof, has exacerbated the problem. Once again, it's vital to consider what can be done for regional cooperation and reduce the attraction for the local population to cooperate with AQIM, Al-Qaeda. The King of Morocco, maybe coincidentally on Sunday, gave a speech on this very topic, and I'm going to quote him. So there's an opening here, and I hope that Algeria sees it. Indeed, our people yearn for a new Maghreb order that transcends insularity and pointless disputes and paves the way for dialogue, consultation, solidarity, and the pursuit of development. An order in which 5 countries of the Maghreb would be the driving force of Arab unity, as well as a key player in the promotion of the Euro-Mediterranean cooperation, stability and security in the Sahel and Sahara, as well as African integration. Now, what's to be done to create this cooperation? On the security front, I think it's incumbent that the U.S. reconsider its dual tracks and piecemeal attempt at regional security strategy. AFRICOM needs to have one plan inclusive of all the countries, which focuses both on cross-border cooperation and intelligence sharing, as well as accelerating interregional training programs for military and security forces. Some countries may not want to work with other countries, but we should insist that for our efforts to work and for our money to be used in a more efficient way, all countries must work together. It's U.S. and French equipment that's the backbone of these existing arrangements, which should give us some leverage. The U.S. should acknowledge also that there's much that countries of the Maghreb can do to learn from one another. Fadel talked about this. One of the things Morocco did successfully was this Reconciliation and Equity Commission. They're talking about a reconciliation process. There's much to be learned from each other on those efforts and other efforts. And to the degree that the United States and the international community can make grants available to bring groups together from civil society, private sector, and perhaps government, to talk about best practices and how to cooperate, maybe that becomes the driving force that governments then have to follow. And there's a good program going on now. They announced the North Africa Partnership for Economic Opportunity, which is an attempt by the State Department to get the private sectors of the Maghreb working together. It's a program that the United States should not be shy in implementing, and it has been shy so far with little or no money. They should put more money into this and really drive this program forward. But on the security front, we need something similar, something that incentivizes working together. This brings us full circle, and I can't sit in a forum without talking about the Western Sahara. It's a Cold War relic, and it's long overdue for resolution. Quite frankly, many countries think that just managing this effort forward is in everybody's best interest. It's not in anybody's interest anymore, given the change that's going on in that region, to have this kind of instability causing a lack of coordination and cooperation between Morocco and Algeria and its neighbors. America can do two things. One, it can do things that will force more cooperation, and two, it can begin to show Algeria and Morocco that it's serious about solving this problem by creating facts on the ground, moving forward to solve the Sahara problem once and for all. The Arab Spring has created opportunities to achieve changes that will break down old barriers to cooperation, and it'll give the region much needed chance at economic development and political reform. It's a mission that can be achieved and will greatly benefit the people and the governments of that region and the larger security interest of the United States. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador Gabriel. For opening to questions, I'd like to take the moderator's prerogative and just turn to maybe just go down our panel and ask, given the challenges as well as opportunities that all of you have highlighted, and maybe forcing a bit of a decision, if given the constrained fiscal environment in which we are currently operating, if there was one or two absolute priorities, given what you've assessed to be the challenges we face, what should those be? Just curious how the panel would respond to them.
I did.
We need a cooperative arrangement between the United States and the countries in North Africa on security and economic arrangements. We got the beginning of that on economics. We also need America and the UN Security Council to take steps together to create facts on the ground in the Western Sahara that tell Algeria and the Polisario the train is moving down the tracks. Jump on this train because we're going to solve it once and for all. So little steps that will encourage Algeria to the table as well.
I think really the challenge in the fiscal environment is just, quite frankly, to stay engaged in Africa, period, security cooperation-wise, duly implemented by the Department of State and Department of Defense. Along with that is the actual ISR allocations to assist countries in building their partnership capacities to interdict narcotics, smuggling, and terrorist networks, and to disrupt them at a minimal so that it's much more economical for the United States at large to help someone else do what we want them to do that's in their mutual interest and regional interest at large as well. The other, I fully agree with the ambassador, is regional cooperation and regional arrangements so that it's conducive for multilateral cooperation and significant diplomacy that covers all the dimensions in terms of political, military, social, so that way the entire region at large can begin to have a mutual understanding of the challenges that remain and the mechanisms utilized to address those challenges for agreed upon ends. And finally, the last point I'll mention again is counter-narcotics, because can't speak about this enough, the nexus between transnational criminal organizations and terrorist organizations that don't necessarily work hand in hand but do cooperate. And you see a lot of these individuals, the Tuareg rebels, for example, where you have a lot of nomadic individuals that go around, and you have also folks in Libya and everywhere around the North African Sahelian region that have economical needs that have not been addressed, a lack of governance, if you will. And that incentivizes people to act a certain way and to be able to help terrorist organizations raise funds through kidnappings and ransom that also affect them. And these displaced individuals, again, at large, agreeing with the ambassador, needs to be addressed on the regional scale, multilateral-wise, to address all the particular societal dimensions.
This is an opportunity. I think Gaddafi's departure, however it creates an opportunity for the United States, for the whole world, to be more engaged in the region. I think he was a cause and a source for instability, not just for the region itself, but it's globally. And I think the tension that he caused in North Africa, as everybody is aware of, he was one of the major elements of the failure of the Maghreb Union, mostly allying with Algeria from time to time and going back and forth and using the Tuareg in the south, using the Polisario. I think right now, with his departure, with Libya is an opportunity. It can be a gateway for the United States and for Europe to help the Libyan succeed, and through engagement in Libya, and I think they can shape the region a little bit more and put a little bit more pressure on Algeria. And Algeria will change, and I think it will be in the next few years. This old leadership will be disappearing from the scene, and I think a new leadership will come and will realize that having issues like the Western Sahara and tension in the region will not be very helpful. The trick, though, was the reluctance of the United States. I had a few meetings with the State Department a couple of weeks ago, and there is a reluctance in engagement of some sort. What I called it is the Iraqi syndrome. It used to be the Vietnam syndrome. Now we got rid of the Vietnam syndrome. Now we have the Iraqi syndrome. We cannot involve you. We got so much involved in Iraq right now. We messed it up. So the thing is, like, we shouldn't be doing anything. And I said, what can be done? If they ask us, we will help. But what if they don't know what they ask for? But then, which is most of the time, because the Libyans, for example, I'm giving you an example of the Libyans, because Libya can be a gateway to impacting the region, and I see this as an opportunity. Is what if they don't know what they ask for or they need? What are their priorities are? There have to be an engagement. And I said the engagement have to be using the Libyan in the diaspora, for example, where there is an office within the State Department that deals with the diaspora. Using the Libyan in the diaspora, using the Tunisian, the Algerian, the Moroccans, the Malis, the Nigerian, people from Nigeria. These can be the link between the two. So you don't come across that United States is imposing itself or coming to tell you what to do, but using those as the link, as the gateway, as the messengers. I think that can be very, very useful. You have to look for partners, and I think they can be the good partners who can be accepted and respected to carry these kind of efforts. So I think there is an opportunity in Libya. It can change the region, and I hope it will, Gaddafi tried to realize unions, and everything they tend to happen after his death. Whatever he tried to achieve in his life failed, but it happened after his death. So that's one of the ironies. So I think this is an opportunity, and Libya's success will give an opportunity to a more security and stability in the region.
Well, those of you that know me know that I shoot from the hip, and I tend to be fairly controversial and straightforward. So, what should the United States do given the current physical constraints? Well, I think it should begin by asking the question, what is the strategic risk posed to the U.S. by activities in the Sahara? At first glance, it seems to me to be none. So perhaps it's best if the United States doesn't do anything. If we think about alliances, the United States has very strong bilateral alliances with Mauritania. It has very strong bilateral alliances with Morocco, with Algeria, ostensibly or potentially with the new Tunisia, with the new Libya, with Mali, with Niger. Okay, as the ambassador pointed out, there are problems with multilateral conversations and multilateral agreements, which have been posed by the persistence of the Western Sahara problem. However, none of the alliances, none of the bilateral alliances are jeopardized. In fact, the U.S. is able to largely advance its agendas in each of these capitals relatively, with some difficulties and with some coaxing, but nonetheless, its objectives are advanced. AQIM, well, I'm not sure AQIM poses much of a threat to the U.S. In fact, I'm not sure it poses much of a threat to France either. Most recently, as of last September, the French counterterrorism judge, I forget his name, the guy who replaced Bruyère. There was Jean-François Bruyère, and then he was replaced by somebody else whose name I forgot. And said in September that he doesn't think that Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb Islamique has the capabilities of targeting France, whether it's ACMI in the Sahara or it's ACMI Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb under Rupta. So does Al-Qaeda pose a strategic threat, or ACMI pose a strategic threat to the United States? I don't think so. That brings up the question that Roger spoke about, which is drug trafficking or drug cartels. I don't have a clearance, so I'm not privy to a lot of data, but I do travel downrange quite a bit. And I am not so sure the extent to which these relationships between Al-Qaeda, ACMI, and the drug traffickers are really all that strong. I mean, we have anecdotal evidence, but we don't have, as far as I know, we don't have real hard evidence that there is a high degree of cooperation between the drug traffickers and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And secondly, the U.S. isn't the market for the drugs that are being transited. It's Europe. So, I mean, maybe and again, I'll be provocative and confrontational, and hopefully this will elicit some criticism and commentary from the participants in the audience. But maybe the Libya model is a good one, where we let Sarkozy lead. We let the Europeans lead. We let other powers that have direct strategic interests in the region, direct threats arising from the region, take the helm. That doesn't deprive us from taking advantage of the opportunities that the region has to offer in terms of bilateral relations or even economic opportunities. Those are going to manifest themselves regardless of who takes the lead in terms of the military or political front. So, given the physical constraints we have now, it might be best to prioritize analyzing the situation to really determine what's at stake. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, and I think that if nothing else will give us a new burst of energy in this as we get into the final part of the program. We're now open to questions. I would ask two things. First, please identify yourself, and two, this really is an opportunity to engage with the panel, and so make it a question, and please, not a speech. If you want a speech, rent your own hall and invite your own. The lady.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Segero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow. I'm based here in Washington, and I'm from Kenya. My question is, what would be or what is the role of African Union in all the Libyan problem fight and the end of Gaddafi? What is the role and what would be the role of African Union? I can hear you mention of Morocco and whether they are northern African countries. One thing I remember, Libya was once Africa, but so what is the role of Libya, of African Union? And the other thing, what is being done with the humanitarian, with the victims, especially the women and the children who are affected in this war? Many of them were victims. What is being done now for them to survive or to be there? Because most of them were innocent and they suffered innocently. What is being done? Thank you.
Maybe we'll take one or two more and then group them together up in the front.
Malik Chuck, I work for Millennium Challenge Corporation. We have programs in Morocco, we work in Niger. My question has to do with the short-term and midterm prospects for stability in the region. Brother Leader is gone, but what are the prospects for stability in Libya, where you have a National Transitional Council, where you have people singing out of different choir books, and you have a situation that was described here that's impacting negatively Niger, Mali, Chad, etc. So my question is, rather than looking at this situation statically, if some of the analysts we have with us this afternoon could look into the looking glass and project what are the prospects for stability in the short to medium term.
Hi, my name is Rachel Smith. I'm with Headquarters Department of the Army International Affairs Africa Branch Chief. My question is more, the Chinese obviously have interest in Libya due to the oil resources and stuff. What is the extent now of their negotiations or workings with the National Transition Council, and how do you see their involvement in the future prospect for establishment of more democratic institutions in Libya, and how do we leverage their activities there to hopefully go down a more democratic and less corrupt environment within the region, especially Libya? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have enough to get us started. Maybe we start with the first question, like on the African Union, and certainly I think Pride Place has Fadel. Would you like to take that, begin with that, and
well, I think the African Union, they were latecomers due to the relationships of the leaders in Africa with Gaddafi, especially Zuma of South Africa. They tried to find a way to help the guy. They offer a couple of initiatives, late initiatives that were not accepted by Gaddafi himself and were not accepted by the NTC. They try to play the middle, and most of the time when you play the middle, you lose. You come up with nothing because you wouldn't be able to help one group or another or create an alliance with one or another. And I think right now the African Union has no influence in what's going on in Libya. They try again to play a role by offering to help rebuild Libya. I don't think that was welcomed by the Libyan people because of the feeling that most of the African leaders stood closely with Gaddafi. The issue of refugees. So I don't think the African Union as an organization is very effective in Libya, or it will be in the future. The problem with Gaddafi, as I mentioned, he invested most of the relationship with a personal relationship between him or financial relationship with some of the African leaders. That even including countries like your country. But the problem with the refugees is a problem that the international effort focused on that early on. Most of the effort of USAID was focused on the refugees that left Libya. And I think I don't see that in Libya or around Libya there is African refugees in neighboring countries, except maybe in Mali and the southern countries who are returning back. But the problem is there are Libyan refugees displaced within Libya too, and lack of financial resources. The NTC is having difficulties helping anybody at that level. There are Libyans who left Sirte, for example, they're living in tents. Hundreds of families, maybe thousands of families inside the country. So it's a problem that I don't think the NTC will be able to help. Hopefully the international community will be able to deal with much better.
A couple points to supplement. Really, I think that the African Union relationships, long-standing relationships, South Africa comes to mind with Gaddafi previously, is certainly going to factor in the calculus of whatever a new Libya is going to look like. And so to what extent that the new Libya is going to be receptive to African Union types of, I don't want to call it encroachment, but influence will certainly be very interesting and something of a development to watch. And also I think that the Libyan people being so proud of their revolution and what has been achieved, I think really what's at stake is seeking Libyan solutions to Libyan problems. And I think that the African Union, to what extent they're going to try to work with the new Libyan government, remains to be seen, and the receptivity, of course, on behalf of the new Libyan government in turn. I think that obviously the African Union has very sizable and sustainable and very robust peacekeeping operations, and we're seeing those peacekeeping operation successes in Mogadishu, particularly in Somalia. At one point, can it be replicated in Libya? I think that with the political factionalism between the East and the West, as well as the significant tribal affiliations, will make that very, very difficult to achieve. There are also very varied contributions on behalf of all AU members in terms of peacekeeping or military operations. Burundi and Uganda, of course, taking the preponderance of those. To answer the question of women and children affected, what is being done to actually address their issues, I venture to say nothing right now at this point, because that's a scary thought, and that's why those non-state actors, particularly Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, they're looking at that to fertilize and to foment additional instability. That's where they operate. They like to operate with individuals that have a sense of hopelessness, have a sense of frustration, grievance against their governments. And this is a recipe for disaster that if it continues to not be focused on, and to be fair with the Libyan government, I mean, you still have the whole issue of the frozen assets that need to be, for lack of a better term, liquefied to be implemented back into Libyan society. And then the challenge, of course, in the TNC is having a provisional government stood up. The revolution that has been done already is over with. People forget about that very quickly, and there's a time window to be able to actually influence the populace. And more importantly, the inclusivity of all elements of Libyans, I think, is very critical to that. So really, in my humble opinion, those are some of the challenges.
Address the gentleman's question from the Millennium Challenge?
Yeah. Just to wrap up then on the African Union, I would just add that it's not just the Libya situation this year, but this has been a very bad year for the African Union. It was behind the curve on Libya, as Fadel's already mentioned. In Cote d'Ivoire, it's had big words, but it was ineffective. And don't quote me on it, go to the Council on Foreign Relations website and you can watch President Ouattara's rather candid remarks about the African Union, its value. And he's the incoming president of the sub-regional organization, ECOWAS, and he has some rather negative things. And I actually had an opportunity to speak to him afterwards, after he said that, and asked him for clarification. He was strong. I said, I presume you don't want that on the record. He said, no, go and tell people what I think. And then, of course, there was the Somali famine. And the African Union couldn't get its act together to hold a pledging conference, much less pay up the pledges that were delivered. You actually look at the pledges that were delivered. Ethiopia and Kenya, the bordering states, have done tremendous things for the famine victims, etc. But the union itself couldn't get its act together to hold a pledging conference, and when it finally had one, collected less than an average of $1 million per country. And South Africa, the richest country in the African Union, pledged $1 million, and it hasn't paid half of it. It's a very bad year, so I would say it's the African Union's upcoming January, the question of the election of the chairperson. There's a real, I think it's one of those moments in history, person where it can make or break the union. You can either go down the road to greater unity and effectiveness or become the OAU reincarnated again. So I think it's going to be an important moment. Then with that, to move on to the Malik's question about prospects for stability, we can start with Geoff.
Yeah. I think that's a critical question. Prospects for stability in Libya, bad. Prospects for stability in Niger, less bad. Regarding Libya, I think there's a high likelihood that we will see some sort of instability related to and potentially driven by violence perpetrated by the militias. As Fadel pointed out, militias are stockpiling weapons. You mentioned the example of Misrata. I've heard stories of depots being raided in western Libya around the Nafusa Mountains and weapons being driven away. This was during the fighting. This was during July, late July, and trucks loaded with weapons being driven away from the front and back into the mountains. Again, another example of stockpiling. For a rainy day, should the different ethnic groups, in this case the Berbers, or in the case of Fadel's example, the Misrata community not feel as if they're fully represented in the political process, they have recourse to other means of exerting their wishes. So I think there's a potential for instability arising out of the militias. I think the disarmament and demobilization process is going to be slow. Obviously there are some fighters against the Gaddafi government who are readily going to give up their weapons. The doctors, the lawyers, the people like you and me, who have no good reason to continue to hold a weapon. There are going to be others that will continue to hang on to their guns, like Fadel pointed out, those who have forged new identities as fighters and are reluctant to give up their weapons. There is something sort of counterintuitive about disarmament programs or weapons collection programs that you can see in other conflict zones, which is that counterintuitively, as the economic conditions worsen, the weapons collections programs actually perform better. If you're offering, you may have limited success offering $200 for a Kalashnikov tomorrow, but if Libya's economic situation worsens, you'll have a much better chance offering $100 for a Kalashnikov in 2 years, as people need the money. So I think there is a potential for violence arising out of the militias. In addition, there is the potential for violence arising from Salafi jihadi quarters. I do want to draw a line between Salafi jihadis writ large, people who subscribe to a violent form of Salafi ideology, and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. I think it's very important to not generalize and to look at the historical relationships between the different Salafi jihadi groups throughout North Africa. And if you look back to the 1990s, there was historical animosities between what was then the GIA, which eventually evolved into the GSPC, which eventually evolved into AQIM. Historical animosities between the Algerianist groups and the LIFG, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. The people there are former LIFG fighters that are now in the TNC, or at least closely affiliated with the TNC, NTC. They probably still harbor their animosities towards the Algerianists, the AQIM successors. So I think there is the potential for Salafi jihadi violence in Libya, but that is going to be distinct from Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb violence. I think it's important to draw a line there. Regarding Niger, I think there's probably a likelihood of instability in the north of the country, but it doesn't pose an existential threat to Niamey in the same way that the instability in Libya will pose an existential threat to Tripoli and Benghazi. Unfortunately, Niamey has a long track record of dealing with instability, and it has a very high threshold for a lack of security in the north, simply because of its historical experiences. And as a consequence, violence in the north doesn't pose a debilitating risk for Niamey. That's my quick assessment.
Yeah. I think Geoff kind of summed up what the short term looks like. And I don't know what the timeline on the short term is. It may be even midterm. Long term, we don't know. But as an optimist, I would say that people of like minds are going to work better together. And what you have now are people of like minds and supposedly Democrats in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco. So the question is, will these create new alliances and new opportunities to learn and work together? The tension is clearly down. Libya was a troublemaker in the region, and there were other problems associated with them. So I don't know what it'll be in the long term, but an optimist would say that there's the opportunity of people of like minds to come together in more unity and grow their countries. I would like to say one thing that Geoff talked about earlier. The interregional trade in North Africa is less than 2%. It's the lowest intra-regional trade of any region in the world. Morocco has one of the few free trade agreements with the United States. There's a great interest for the United States to help grow North Africa for business reasons, economic reasons, investment reasons. So we can't underestimate the importance of that. I think more than, you can correct me, more than half of the shipping goes through the Straits of Gibraltar of the world. Something like that, maybe even higher than that. So don't underestimate the importance of the southern border of the Straits of Gibraltar and what failed states could do in that region. Having said all that, I think Geoff's right. I think that there's more interest for the Europeans to show leadership in this regard. And in that sense, I think President Obama got it absolutely right on Libya. He made the Arabs declare themselves up front. The Europeans and NATO go first, and we were right there, and it was thanks to us that a lot of this goodwill happened. So I think there is a model there for the Europeans to take the lead, not only in terms of military actions, but perhaps in terms of security actions. But we have a vested interest in that. We have a very vested interest to partner with our Europeans, as I said earlier, to see this happen. And we also have a vested interest for American reasons as well. So I do want to say that, and I think that with economic growth can come more stability. That takes time. Individual markets are not as interesting, quite frankly, as a regional market. So again, we go back to cooperation and ability to work together, even if it's in the economic realm. So I tend to be an optimist long term.
If I may, just want to provide some supplemental points. from my humble opinion, I think that the issue really deals with political factionalism and intra-tribal rivalries. Also you have East versus West. I mean, since 1969, right, it's been Tripolitanian, basically, that's been ruling Libya. And so now it remains to be seen, is that power going to be shifted towards the East? What kind of inclusivity will there be in the new Libya, what that will look like? I think that's very, very fundamental and paramount to this future stability of Libya. Also, the other issue, I think, is that the NTC does not have necessarily the authority over all the militias that are being operating. I would argue that the TMC, the Transitional Military Council, doesn't even have control of it. In particular, Abdel Hakim Bilhaj, doesn't necessarily have control, and he's trying to politically and militarily posture himself to be kind of the de facto Secretary of Defense, if you will, in Libya. And that's a big issue. And so there's a lot of political posturing. A lot of people don't like him in Libya because you have rivalries with the people in Tripoli. He was the guy that went into the compound of al-Gaddafi. And at the same time, he had the issue where he had Misrata that had unbelievable amounts of shelling that they sustained. Then you have the folks in Sirte, which actually captured and killed Gaddafi. Then you have the folks in the Safusa Mountains. So you have a lot of different people that say, wait a minute, I contributed too. This is not just you. And I think that that's a challenge. I think the other thing is the NTC street cred. I think that people rely on exiles a lot, and they are a tremendous resource and fundamentally important to the future of Libya. However, to what extent the street cred they have in Libya is also an issue, because someone once told me perception is reality. That's all that matters. And the other thing I'd like to mention is within the political posturing, you have, which I think a lot of people don't discuss enough, the Qatari influence that has actually happened in Libya as of late. And the Qataris really, from a GCC standpoint, Gulf Cooperation Council, is trying to project its influence in areas outside of its region, and their style of governance is very much, Bedouin tent style, where, everybody's welcomed and everybody has and welcomed with an opinion. And so how they're going to reintegrate those fighters that had tenuous links with LIFG or other organizations, how you're going to implement the demobilization process is going to be critical.
You're going to respond to the tribe of Glasgow.
Anyone, our colleague from the Army's question about China. I don't know much about Chinese foreign policy interests in Libya, but I can speak to China's oil interests, as well as the attitudes within the Libyan hydrocarbon sector towards China and towards the United States. So just briefly, it's important not to overestimate China's oil interest in Libya. Yes, the CNPC has interest in Libya, but they're not currently producing. They weren't producing before the conflict either. They were still in the exploration phases. So I think they may have one block, and I'm not sure what the prospects of that block are. Even prior to the conflict, the Chinese had sort of misplayed their hand in Libya. A lot of times when Chinese investment comes, it comes in the form of sort of shuttle diplomacy, where the Chinese come, they make their investment offer, they send workers, but they never establish a presence. And they did the same thing in Libya, which rubbed the Libyans, at least under the Gaddafi administration, the wrong way. It was critical as a foreign company that was interested in doing business in Gaddafi's Libya to establish a presence there. The Chinese never did that, and they started off on the wrong foot. A lot of the hydrocarbon sector leadership in the post-Gaddafi Libya is the same as it was in the Gaddafi administration, just by dint of the lack of a limited body of technocrats capable of running the hydrocarbon sector. So the current roster of high-level leadership in the NTC, at least for the hydrocarbon sector, oil and gas, is Ali Tarhouni, University of Washington, Seattle, economics professor. We have Nuri Borin. We have Benyeza, Abdurrahman Benyeza, is that his name? Yeah. Abdurrahman Benyeza, who was the head of the NOC, ENI, the Italian oil company, JV. He has strong Western exposure. There is a strong tendency within the hydrocarbon sector as a whole to prefer U.S. companies. A lot of the technocrats were trained in the U.S. All of the metering, for example, in Libya was installed by U.S. companies during the 1960s and 1970s. Everybody's familiar with U.S. companies. There is the brand name recognition, and there's also the technological capabilities. So there are a lot of questions surrounding the return of U.S. and international oil companies to Libya, just across the board. But it's once the dust settles, I think that Libya will prefer U.S.-based companies or European-based companies to Chinese ones, and that's going to limit China's ability to exert pressure on the direction that the NTC takes through investment. But I hope that answers your question.
When it comes to China, I was in Kenya, I was in Ghana in December, and I was very concerned about, I'm sure you guys are, the Chinese presence in Africa in general. And it's not a good presence. I mean, even Gaddafi, who was very close to China, he called it the soft recolonization of Africa. They come, they take over, they bring their own workers, they don't invest in the country. The money, they recycle the money with their own worker, they send it back to China. So it's not a very attractive investment at all. And I think really they are not doing a good job for Africa at all. And I think the Libyans and Libyans understand that. That's one. The other thing is China was not very supportive of the uprising at all. I mean, they sent weapons to Gaddafi. They supported him. They were very reluctant. I'm sure they felt that they did one of the biggest mistakes by abstaining and not vetoing the United Nations Security Council. Then, when a few months after, they sent a couple of delegations. They want to open talks with the NTC in Benghazi. They tried to rebuild the relationship. They offered some humanitarian help, a couple of airplanes with some help and one ship. I don't think they came to fruition. Libya is in two things. One, to your point, is they are looking inward. They are not looking outward in terms of influencing the country around the world, like Gaddafi used to do, is to have his fingers in every place. Number two is they are looking western, toward the west, more than they are looking toward China or south toward Africa. And I think these are two trends we have to keep in mind while we're looking at Libya in the future.
Very quickly, I think the bottom line is China doesn't have any state power. I think that's just really what it comes down to in terms of international engagement. They don't invest internationally to the magnitude that we do of security cooperation. They go in, they do what they need to do. They are an efficient, extremely well-oiled machine. And at the end of the day, they don't necessarily care about the actual regional stability as much as they care about their economical as well as anything that will help them project power in the South China Sea. Wherever there is oil, wherever there is resources, China will be there, always has, always will. So from that perspective, there is a strategic competition, but I fully agree with Fadel, because at the end of the day, Libya is going to be more Western oriented, in my humble opinion, as opposed to looking into China. And the last thing is that long-standing Chinese policies where they do rub people off the wrong way in the international community, where they hire their own people, they go in, they build massive projects, And it in many ways disenfranchises the indigenous population because they're not necessarily included as a part of that in the economic development of any particular venture.
We're unfortunately, we've run out of time. Appreciate everyone coming here this afternoon for the session, and especially to the panelists for giving their time and their experience and knowledge. So thank you very much for joining us today.